Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. We have another great show for you tonight. And this might be one of these shows you might want to record, or when you look at the YouTube afterwards, maybe share it with friends and associates, because what we're going to be covering tonight is pretty shattering. We'll be looking at economics. Now, before you switch off, economics can be hugely interesting. And we have a guest tonight who's going to help us get to that appreciation. Now, you know something, this is our 188th show. Think about that, right? And for those of you who've been with us throughout that whole period, thank you very much. But do tell your friends. And also, you'll notice that I am now on the Blue Sky app. So if you want to join me there, you'd be very welcome. I've got many thousands of followers on Twitter, but I'd like to have at least the same number on that app. So please go there and you'll see all the news that you don't get on the regular channels. I mean, for example, how many of you know that the hospitals in England are in a much parlous state compared to those in Scotland? Now, I know if you consume BBC Scotland News, you may have come to the opposite view, but that would be wrong because the facts speak for themselves. This also, by the way, applies to schools. And many of the schools in England are rotting and they're unable to cope with the demands. Now, in terms of hospitals in particular, this is a grievous situation because people do depend very much, particularly as they get older, on having decent medical care. But when you get queues of ambulances outside hospitals, then it's hard to see how that degree of care can be afforded. And one other thing I'd like to say in terms of this being a great day for British democracy, think of this for a second, and the winter fuel allowance. If BBC Scotland was professional, they would be interviewing the stricken families who'd lost elderly relatives due to the Labour's winter fuel allowance measures and the fiasco, because that's news. That people are imperiled and in jeopardy. That's news. As Benjamin Franklin said all those hundreds of years ago, news is what somebody somewhere doesn't want to see in print. Anything else is advertising. And in large part, BBC Scotland is in the advertising business. They advertise the Labour Party. Next year, it could be reform. Who knows? Depends what somebody in London says they ought to do. It's as simple as that. And that's why broadcasting isn't devolved. But you knew that. I don't have to tell you that. I want to make a quick remark about the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, before we move on to our guest. And it's this. And it speaks to the fact that for many people, Starmer's behaviour seems unprincipled. And it might be summed up this way. And this is a quote. He's decided only to be undecided, resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, and solid for fluidity. I owe these remarks to Winston Churchill, who was talking about someone else completely. But nonetheless, I think they apply with some real relevance to the present leader of the Labour Party. I say present because how much longer he can continue in that role is anyone's guess. Anyway, enough of all that. Let's move on to our guest tonight. Tonight we have the particular pleasure and privilege of speaking to Robbie Mochrie, who's Associate Professor of Economics at Heriot-Watt University and does many other things beside. Those of you who haven't seen his work in the national Sunday national newspapers can go back to a piece he wrote on the 5th of November 2022 when he talked about how there are lessons for Scotland in the history of pre-independence Ireland. It's very good, as all of his work is. Anyway, without any further ado, let's move on and welcome Robbie Mochrie. How are you, Robbie?
Very well. Great to be with you, John.
It's a great pleasure to have you. Can I start off with a question that might, I suspect, be in the minds of many people when they think about economics, and it's this. Is there a place for ethics in economics?
Oh, well, Yes, absolutely. I mean, and I think that's an invitation for me to talk about the book which I wrote last year, which I published last year, called How to Think Like an Economist. Because I start with that by arguing that economics emerged from ethics. Indeed, I'd go further. It's only really since the Second World War that economists have been concerned particularly about questions of measurement and mathematics. Before that, economics was still largely part of ethics. And so when I was writing the book, one of the things that I wanted to do was to explain where that separation came. I'd rather assume that it would be shortly after Adam Smith, maybe as far through the middle of the 19th century, someone like John Stuart Mill. But then I discovered that Alfred Marshall started off as a mathematician, trained in ethics, finally ended up in economics, shaped economics in the early 20th century. John Maynard Keynes, his pupil, absolutely impossible to think about him in any way other than as an applied philosopher. In fact, the equivalent of his doctorate was on the logic of probability. He was a philosopher of uncertainty, and that made him the great explainer of what was happening during the Great Depression. But by the time Keynes was finished, young economists had become interested in how to explain economic ideas mathematically. And anyone who's done a degree in the 40 years or so since I was an undergraduate student will think of economics as being much more about maths than about philosophy or ethics. But that's a recent innovation.
It's interesting you should say that. I used to talk to boards of directors. I set up a company that dealt with business ethics. And despite what you may have thought, it was quite a success. And one of the things I used to do was to speak to boards of directors about morality and principles and ethics. And I used to show them quotes from The Wealth of Nations, and they were very much approving. And then I saw them give them a quote from I think it was The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I said, who's that? And they said, some raving lefty. And I had to tell them, actually, it's the same guy.
Yes, indeed.
It's Adam Smith, the guy you approved of 5 minutes ago, but disapprove of today. Yes. And the intention wasn't to make anyone feel small. It was just simply to say, you guys need to know more.
Yes.
You do need to know more. You might seek out a friendly academic and spend some time usefully there. Mm-hmm. But, it's important to talk about morality and ethics because it's easy to lose sight of some of these important concerns when you're dealing with business matters. And particularly when you're measured by short-term results.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so, I think that's that's a slightly different issue perhaps, but part of what has become interesting, you've mentioned the fact that what is important is what we can measure, and it is much easier to measure profit than to measure something like the impact of, let's say, a teacher or a social worker, or indeed a care worker. And I'm sure that one of the reasons why it is so hard to recruit people to these particular professions is that the pay is low because we don't put value on looking after each other in the way that perhaps we should.
Yeah, and it's very difficult, particularly in today's climate. I've just been watching an interview with the next president of the United States, in the course of which he threatened to apply tariffs on Mexico in order to deal with the drug problem. He also said that Ukraine was Europe's problem, and he wanted little to do with it. He also was asked, do you plan to go to war with Canada? And he said, no, I intend to occupy them by economic force. His supporters are also talking about taking back the Panama Canal from China. And one of his supporters tonight, Senator Tommy Tuberville, has said that the reason we need to take back the Panama Canal is because there might be a war with China. How do these sentiments make you feel, Robbie?
Oh gosh, well, it makes me feel like we're back in round about 1913, not 1932. 1913, when particularly European governments, thought that they could throw their weight around, and they ended up clashing with each other, and we ended up in the misery of the Great War. If the greatest power in the world, the greatest economic power, the greatest military power, thinks that it can simply impose its will on the rest of the world, it is hard to see a good outcome.
I mean, somebody might argue that the quickest way to lead a small country is to start with a very large country. And that might be what happens to the United States. I mean, it's hard to see how the United States, and particularly the people in it, would not be damaged by a unilateral application of tariffs. Because my experience, but I'd love to hear from you, is that that tariffs invariably produce a reaction, a counter-reaction.
It's not even that. It's that the tariffs are going on the wrong things for the American economy, so that they increase the costs of doing business in the United States hugely, without actually having very much effect on the countries that they're targeting. If China's steel faces tariffs, then it will look to other markets. The United States is not such a large producer that it can affect that. It may look, remembering of course that the United States is actually part of a free trade area involving Mexico and Canada, it may look to those countries, expecting that it will be easier to export from these countries into the United States. And that leads to further retaliation. So then there's, of course, and you're quite right, there's a possibility of counter tariffs. There's also the possibility, I mean, if I was the new Prime Minister of Canada, or I to be the new Prime Minister of Canada in a few months' time, then I might well be, rather as Chrystia Freeland, the former Finance Minister, suggested, be looking at something like export, rather than simply meekly accepting import tariffs from the United States, I might be looking at export tariffs on our uranium and our oil going to the United States, to make the cost of doing business in the United States greater and to generate revenue that way. If I was the Prime Minister of Denmark, knowing how much, well, not just Lego, but how much Americans love the weight loss drugs that Novo Nordisk has produced, I would say, well, let's impose huge export subsidies on them, export levies on them, and only if they're going to the United States. And let's do all our American exports through a shell company in the British Virgin Islands, nice tax haven, put on huge markups and make great profits for ourselves. So let's exploit America's reluctance to cooperate with the rest of the world. I think that
I just find the whole thing very odd. I mean, I've just finished reading a book on supply chains and the impact of COVID, and it was horrendous for many manufacturers in the United States. Why? Because they were using China as a manufacturing base, and also they were deeply wedded to the just-in-time process. In other words, they had no warehouses, there was no storage, so there was no buffer. So if China, as happened in the case of COVID, decided that it couldn't supply, there was nowhere to go. You couldn't get your gearbox from a warehouse because it didn't exist in a warehouse. It came directly from China. You couldn't get your fluffy toy from the warehouse because it too was produced in China. In other words, America doesn't make a lot anymore, it assembles a lot. And of course, there's a very vibrant IT area and many others, of course, that produce significant revenues. But when it comes to having a war with one of your main suppliers, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Yes, indeed. But this was the argument which was put forward over 100 years ago, that there would not be a war amongst the European powers because they were so closely integrated with each other economically. And that this was, here I will throw in a little bit of economics, this was the period of the gold standard. when it was perfectly possible for somebody to take gold coins from Britain's sovereigns or half sovereigns or something like that, and to exchange them in France or Italy without any question. Because they were gold, their value was well known and well understood, and so they could circulate in other countries. Now, we've lost that ability to, that degree of economic integration. It was said, there will never be another war. But political ambition got in the way. And the desire to be more powerful than other countries. And I think we're seeing this in the United States at a time when, go back to the 1950s, the United States produced roughly half of the world's output, half of the value added economically in the world. Now it's down to less than 20%, and it's falling. So the United States, despite the great technology companies that you've mentioned, the United States is not in a position to dictate terms. I think, in fact, it is something of that loss of influence and power which is driving the political changes that we're seeing in America. People no longer are confident that their country is going to be richer and more prosperous in the future than it was now, 20 years ago. But they're also thinking, we're no better off than we were 20 years ago. In fact, we're worse off. So it's very easy for a populist like Trump to say, all we need to do is to make other people pay more. All we need to do is ship home the migrants. Oh, by the way, that means that crops are going, you said America doesn't produce very much. Well, that means that you're going to get rid of many of the people who do the jobs which are necessary for production, if that actually happens. So I would say it's a very difficult situation for the United States. I hope that in Congress, where Mr. Trump's Republicans only have a very narrow majority, that it will be difficult for him to get some of the more damaging pieces of legislation that he might have in mind through. But I expect that he will rely very heavily on executive orders to make sure that he can get quite a lot of his plans put into place. And even that will at least have the advantage. If they are damaging to the United States, people will know that it's the president's fault and not anyone else's.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's hard to see how it wouldn't be damaging, because it seems to me, for all the obvious reasons. We've had a question from Charles Smith, and he's asking, ask Professor Mochrie an answer to individuals accumulating excess financial clout today. I think you might be thinking about Elon Musk and others. What's your view? Economically, is this an inevitable outcome of the economics we have in play today, or is this an aberration?
I would say that, firstly, how do you define wealth? Because a large part of the wealth that we are seeing here is wealth which exists only on paper. And a small number of companies, their shares have increased in value hugely. Now, I'm reminded actually of a story which the Nobel Prize winning economist Robert Solow used to tell about equilibrium. If you dropped a melon off the Empire State Building as it passed the 84th floor, the melon would still be in equilibrium. As it got past the 20th floor, it would be in equilibrium. As soon as it reached the ground, it wouldn't. In other words, by any measure, US stock markets are hugely overvalued. I start off a course I teach called Money, Banking and Financial Crises by pointing out that the average period between financial crises in the United States is 22 years. That means that, I think that if we did something, if we deregulated Bitcoin, I think that we might even not need to wait as long as 22 years. So I'm telling my students now, this isn't history. This is what you're going to need to know to navigate the world in a few years' time. And so I would say that one of the things which that share valuations which have just lost touch with reality, or somewhere in outer space, possibly on a mission to Mars and hopefully not coming back. Those valuations will lead to a crash. And at that point, the people who are supposed to be incredibly wealthy at the moment will suddenly appear less wealthy. Now, there are other problems. Certainly, it's the case that if we had more progressive taxation, if we had a recognition that, and this comes back to ethics, that there's a large degree of chance and luck in people becoming extremely wealthy, then I think that we might well find that we could easily control much of that wealth, and that would be a good thing for democratic governments.
Yeah. I mean, David McGuinness is asking a sort of associated question. Do you think that wealth inequality is the biggest problem facing the economy?
No, it depends how you're looking at this. I would say that the very biggest problem facing the economy is how to manage a green transition. On the basis that if we, I'm not sure whether it's boil or bake the planet, or just burn it, as we've seen in Los Angeles today, that game over. That's the end of the story. So that is pretty much an existential threat, I would say.
Yeah.
Inequality, I would say, is important for all sorts of reasons. One important part about entrenched inequality is that it means that people of real talent and skill don't end up with the opportunities which they would need to develop those skills, get the rewards from those skills or talents, so they don't bother trying as hard as they might otherwise. And I don't think that it's any coincidence that the European countries, which are always at the top of well-being tables, or social well-being tables, are also the ones which have the most equal societies. And so I think that equality is very valuable in terms of enabling long-term well-being. So yes, even though it may be a more boring society than something like the United States.
Some people say that inequality is baked into capitalism. Do you agree with that?
Now, that depends. That I would have to say depends to some extent what model of capitalism you're using. I mean, there isn't just one type of capitalism. I remember when I was a postgraduate student spending a lot of time understanding comparative economic systems, and the obvious difference is that between, on the one hand, at one extreme, you have the economy of the United States, and on the other hand, you have the economies of places like Japan and Germany. The Japanese, by the way, I'm putting together with Germany because when Japan decided that it was going to open its borders and join the industrial world in the middle of the 19th century, in the last third of the 19th century, they sent civil servants all around Europe to work out which kind of economic system would be best for the country. And they chose Germany's, basically. And Germany at that time was doing wonderful, what was economically conservative, certainly capitalist, but the extreme right-wing chancellor, the Iron Chancellor Bismarck, was also introducing national insurance, state pensions. He was making it possible for the ordinary people to share in the success of the economy. So is it baked into capitalism? Only if you define capitalism in such a way that it will be baked in.
Interesting. I want to mention your book because it seems to me that a lot of people tonight may be thinking, hey, I'd like to know a little bit more, and there's a limited amount of time that we have tonight. But tell us a little bit about your book, if you wouldn't mind, the one that you published with Bloomsbury.
Sure. So as I think I mentioned before, it's called How to Think Like an Economist. It came out with Bloomsbury last year. It's one of a series. So there was already How to Think Politically and How to Think Like a Philosopher. And I feel in many ways, How to Think Like an Economist is completes a trilogy, really. You can't separate these three ways of thinking about the world: philosophy, politics, and let me say, rather than economics, the economy. Because one of the points which I start the book off with is saying we are all economists. We're all economists because we live in a world where we have to think about how we manage resources. And that's really what economics is about. Some of us have just spent more time and have longer words that we use to describe what we're thinking about. But essentially, everybody has to be an economist to some extent. And so what that means, I would say, is that in terms of the brief I was given, I started by thinking about the economy of ancient Greece and how great philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, first thought about the economy. Then I explain how essentially economic ideas infiltrated their way into Western thought, concentrating particularly on the scholastic philosophers in Paris in the 13th century, especially St. Thomas Aquinas. And it's only after that that I jump, and it is still quite a leap at that point, to Edinburgh in 1776 and Adam Smith's publication of The Wealth of Nations. After that, the book settles down, and I mentioned already that one of the things that I was interested in as I was writing was to think about the relationship between economics and ethics, and to show that much of the best thinking about economics has strong ethical foundations. Now, that allowed me to get as far as the period just before World War II, when John Maynard Keynes revolutionized economics by saying we actually have to think about the whole economy. And really, after that, that's about halfway through the book, almost the second half of it is about how economists have responded to Keynes's ideas. And perhaps that begins almost immediately with Friedrich Hayek or Milton Friedman, but it's true of many of at least half of the other people who appear in the book. Their approach to economics is really a direct response to Keynes's thinking about the economy. That's how important he is. And for Keynes, the important points about the economy were to ensure that everybody lived a good life. It was very much an ethical perspective, and an ethical perspective which had its origins in ancient Greek society. The one thing that I would caution about both of them, Aristotle, writing for Greek society, talking about the idea of well-being, was thinking only about well-being for male citizens of Athens who could tell their slaves what to do, and probably their wives and children as well. Keynes, Cambridge Dawn, for him, well-being was supping champagne and eating oysters before he went off for a night at the opera. That's the life he wanted us all to live. So it's pretty elite stuff.
Yeah.
And other people may have different ideas of what well-being is. So
yeah, well, that's true. That's true. I mean, it's fascinating. I'm always intrigued by how great men deliver suggestions and proposals and various theses about how the world ought to be organized. And I'm thinking now about the founding fathers who said, and they all endorsed this, they said, all men are created equal. And just about all of them had slaves.
Yes, indeed.
Which is an interesting way of looking at life. But so here we have Keynes having an enormous impact. But then along comes Milton Friedman, and he's saying, it's all about the money. You don't have to worry about any of this ethics stuff. Have I misconstrued what he said?
I think to some extent, yes. I mean, Friedman was working in a quite different ethical tradition from Keynes, but the great 1970 New York Times article, which is intended to be a summary of Capitalism and Freedom, Friedman's book, ends by emphasizing the importance of businesses making profit in the context of the constraints which society puts on business activity. So Friedman is thinking about legal constraints, but those legal constraints almost inevitably will reflect ethical considerations. So I think that Friedman understood very much the importance of ethics, but whereas Keynes was quite willing, because he thought the world was so uncertain, was quite willing for government to take a leading role in coordination, Friedman continued to trust in individual genius in a way that Keynes didn't.
And there's also an anomaly there. If he's saying you ought to be as successful as you possibly can within the constraints of the law, then he's leaving personal ethics to one side. In other words, if the law doesn't prescribe an activity, then you're free to do it. I mean, my experience of working with senior executives and the research amongst senior executives who retired suggests that the thing that troubled them most in their retirement was that they wished they'd behaved better when they were working. That's an ethical view of life. In other words, if you simply say to people, as long as it's not illegal, you can do it, it takes you into a very, in my humble opinion, in a very peculiar place, I would say, because it then, in fact, it does encourage lobbying. It encourages reaching out to politicians and saying, I'm about to do something very bad right now, but it's okay if you pass a law that allows me to do it. And by the way, here's a big chunk of money to help you decide your options here. And pretty much it seems to me that's just two of the flaws.
Well, yes, I mean, I trying to be as fair as possible to Milton Friedman here. I think he would have pointed out, hold on, that chunk of money is a bribe. That's illegal, should be illegal, is definitely unethical.
No, lobbying is not unethical. Is maybe unethical.
You said here's a large chunk of money. Perhaps you didn't mean here's a large chunk of money in a brown envelope.
Well, the reason I say that actually, I used to spend a lot of time with executives who would say to me, "But John, we don't pay bribes because we're covered by the American Foreign Corrupt Practices Act." And I said, "Well, that's just legalized bribery. Why is that?" I said, because the law says, I mean, it's hard to imagine that any law saying this, you can, an American can bribe a foreigner up to, I think it's $50 in order to facilitate the passage, let's say, of some package through customs or through the docks more expeditiously. But that money must never find its way back to the US.
Well, by the way, are you aware that 3/4 of the dollars that are printed are circulating outside the United States? That's largely how organized crime is financed. So,
Exactly.
I mean, that's just a token contribution to that flow.
You know, it's crazy, isn't it? We've got another question here. Can the Scottish Government make progress on a well-being economy without full financial powers to deliver it?
Right, that's yes is the short answer. Certainly. Now, I think here we're going to have a little bit of a discussion of what we mean by a well-being economy. It doesn't, as someone has recently claimed, mean paying a slightly higher state pension. Although that's a welcome step. I think that a well-being economy, I would go, again, looking, for example, to Scandinavian countries, it's about the rights of a citizen and the social benefits which accrue from citizenship, particularly, which begin before birth. Look at what happens in, well, particularly Finland, which for many years has had the lowest level of infant mortality, the lowest level of maternal mortality, because every woman and unborn child is looked after well.
Yep.
That is a social obligation.
Yep.
And that continues in these countries with excellent education in all sorts of ways, which leads to training, allows people to lead, allowing people to to reach adulthood, go into employment or the workforce or higher education, whatever it may be, and hopefully lead more fulfilled lives in which they're more productive. And at the end, there will be good health services throughout their lives, but as they get towards the end of their lives, there is particularly going to be good elder care and ultimately end-of-life care. Yeah. So that arc from really from conception to death is where the well-being economy has to come from. Now, I've mentioned these countries. One of the important things about them is that they have much higher taxes than in the United Kingdom. And yes, the Scottish government could in principle raise taxes, but it's difficult to do with the current fiscal settlement. So I'm going to park that to one side. I'll assume that there are no fiscal levers.
Yeah.
But what I'm describing there generally are long-term objectives which can be best achieved through political consensus. And I think that this is one of the important things, that if you ask people across the political spectrum in Scotland what it is that they think constitutes, what they think is necessary for a good economy, they are much more likely than people in England. This is a political split which has lasted for actually 200 years at least. People in Scotland tend to be much more willing than people in England to assert that well-being comes from society rather than purely from the economy. And so that, I think, is what the Scottish government has to build on. Now, this is not a short process. I know, for example, there's been a lot of talk about the Nordic countries, but I think that the Scottish government's own work has emphasised the position that Denmark's in, and has argued that Denmark is a particularly good comparator for Scotland of what might be possible. Denmark has had that political consensus in place for at least 40, possibly 50 years. It's taken a long time. It's been small changes over that time, but it's been a consistent outperformance of what we've achieved in the United Kingdom and indeed in Scotland. Well, and when I say Scotland and the United Kingdom, it turns out that part of devolution is that we have closed the gap between what was possible in England and what was possible in Scotland, as we already with the limited powers which have been moved from London to Holyrood, we have actually seen an improvement in outcomes in Scotland over the last 25 years. So
it's interesting.
Yes, there are certainly possibilities, but there are no quick wins.
Yeah. I noticed that Mark Telfer has pointed out that Finland has completed their 2-year, I think, UBI, which is Universal Basic Income, I suppose, project, and noted no discernible issues with its economy or productivity. It also boasts a population that enjoy their quality of living. That goes back to your earlier point about the Scandinavian countries. I don't think you described them as such, but you said progressive companies. I can't remember the terminology you used.
Yes. I would, rather than progressive, I would say citizen-centered.
Yeah.
The politics there. They are in some ways quite conservative, but when it comes to thinking about questions of well-being, they emphasise that everybody has a right to share in the prosperity of the country. Yeah,
so that's very Keynesian then.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. thinking about going back to the economists again, you covered 24 economists in your book. So I'm going to ask you the question that's inevitable, and that's asked of people who have a family. Which of your children do you like best? Which of these economists do you have a particular liking for?
Well, what I would say is every time, whichever one I was writing about at the time, just about. And writing about Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek in particular is fascinating. When I was a young lecturer, one of my colleagues, whose first degree was in philosophy, told me that Hayek was his favorite economist, and I just couldn't imagine how this could be possible. But then when I came to write the book, and reading what Hayek was arguing, particularly in the 1950s when he was in Chicago, there was just so much. But if you absolutely said you're only allowed to choose one economist, I'm afraid it would have, well, I'm not afraid, I'm quite proud of the fact it would be Maynard Keynes.
Right. And what did you particularly like about Hayek? I mean, my limited reading of him is that he was, okay, a liberal with a capital L, but perhaps fairly right-wing in many respects. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, Hayek claimed to be going back to the social philosophy of Adam Ferguson. He was extremely widely read, and so he could distinguish very easily between the thought of Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson in Edinburgh in the 18th century. And that meant that he tended to be very skeptical about the ideas of his friend. And I think it's important to remember that they did end up, after a stormy beginning to the relationship, Hayek and Keynes ended up being friends.
Really?
Absolutely, yes. Keynes wrote a long letter of appreciation to Hayek on the way back in 1944 when he read Road to Serfdom, and said it's an absolutely essential argument. Now, Keynes had a bit of knowledge of had a huge amount of knowledge about what totalitarian government would do. His wife was Russian. He visited the Soviet Union twice. She was her family. She was a ballerina, and her family were associated with the arts from Tsarist times, and made the transition into Soviet times. So Keynes had very few illusions about what was happening in the Soviet Union. Asked to write a comment on the 80th birthday of Beatrice Webb. He said, Mrs. Webb has lived to the age of 80. This would be impossible in her beloved Soviet Union. But as for Hitler and the Nazis, Keynes had a huge reputation in Germany. From the time that he wrote Economic Consequences of the Peace, where he said, what you're going to do, what you're doing in Paris at the end of World War I is going to destabilize Europe and will lead to the rise of a strong man.
Yeah.
14 years later, Hitler in power. Almost immediately in a public lecture, Keynes talked about the blonde beasts and the unchained irresponsibles in Germany.
Yeah.
And one of his loudest early supporters in Britain was Oswald Mosley.
Yeah.
Who, when Mosley congratulated Keynes on the ideas which were starting to appear and eventually became his general theory of employment, Keynes said, yes, and I'm doing it precisely to stop you.
Yeah. I mean, that was an interesting time, the 32 and leading up to eventually to the New Deal in 1938. I think your view is that Roosevelt, who was a major power behind the New Deal, didn't begin that way.
Oh no! Roosevelt, Roosevelt started off. I mean, he was progressive Democrat from 20 years before. He'd, of course, suffered polio in 1921, spent most of the 1920s carefully rebuilding his career at a time when the Democrats were out of office. So he kept in the public eye. He started his institute at Warm Springs in Georgia. That kept him very much in public focus, but not actually having to be actively political. And then he was persuaded at the end of 1928 to put his name forward for election to be governor of New York. And he snuck through when Democrats all around the country were losing elections. So suddenly, in something like 6 weeks, Roosevelt went from being a political nobody, at best a character actor, to being in the limelight, and being the most plausible Democrat candidate for the 1932 presidential election. Not only that, he was the governor of what was then the most populous state in the Union. It had New York had 45 out of, 516 electoral college votes.
Oh.
So hugely important, a bit like the governor of California is today, I guess. A position from which 3 people in the previous 50 years had made it to the White House. So Roosevelt looked suddenly like he was a potential candidate. And then the Wall Street crash took place, the American economy collapsed. And I think the best way to describe this, I mean, there's all sorts of ways you can describe it. There were soup kitchens everywhere. There were shanty towns springing up in every city. Factories just shut down, stayed closed for the whole of the 1930s. Unemployment never went below 10% in the 1930s. Since 1945, it's been above 10% for 10 months in the United States. So the situation in the United States, for every $2 that was being spent in the American economy at the start of 1930, only $1 was being spent by the end of 1932, when Roosevelt had just won the presidential election. And Roosevelt went around, he was promising a new deal for the American people. He promised to govern the interests of the forgotten man, the ordinary citizen who had worked hard, who paid his taxes, and who suddenly found that he was down on his luck, no longer able to support his wife and family. I mean, this was a time when men were breadwinners, largely. And Roosevelt made all these promises. There was this soaring rhetoric during the election campaign. He really didn't know what he was going to do. But he knew from his experience of polio that if you don't know what to do to solve a problem, you try something. And if it doesn't work, you try something else. And you keep going on, garnering little bits of experience and knowledge until you've got something which works. Now, while Roosevelt was campaigning, over in Cambridge, Maynard Keynes went to he gave a total of 8 lectures to his students every year. I wish I had that kind of contract. So Maynard Keynes giving his 8 lectures, and the lecture theatres were packed. Keynes was one of the greatest, had by this time become one of the greatest public intellectuals in England, not just an economist, much, much more than an economist. And he started to give the lectures didn't make sense to the students at first. They were just a series of definitions. But what he was doing was setting out the principles of the Keynesian revolution and saying, this is how you have to think about the economy in a new way. So really what I would have to say, what I think is particularly impressive about Keynes, is that he was well aware that he needed very good ideas. If his ideas didn't get in place quickly enough, almost certainly someone like Moseley or Huey Long in the United States, or in Germany, Hitler, would come to dominate political discourse, and liberalism would be destroyed. The whole liberal democratic project would be destroyed. Keynes understood that. And so he spent the time from 1932 through to 1937, when he nearly died from heart failure, making sure that his ideas were out in the public, but not just talking, trying to persuade economists who were wedded to their way of thinking about the economy as being a self-organizing mechanism, that you could never really have a Great Depression. It's a bit like there are conservative economists who argue that there was never really a financial crisis which caused a recession in 2009. But Keynes also realized the importance of influencing politicians. And he knew the only politicians that would be willing to put his ideas into practice were in Washington in the Roosevelt administration, and so he targeted them very specifically. So by 1938, Roosevelt finally accepted that his ideas that you had to have a balanced budget, you had to pay your way as you were going, simply weren't working. They'd thrown the economy back into recession in 1937. So finally, he accepted that he would have to have a budget deficit. And that essentially meant that what we had was a Keynesian economy in the United States, or a Keynesian government in the United States just before the Second World War.
So he wasn't quite printing money, but he was spending money.
Oh, he was spending money, absolutely, yes. I mean, Keynes, from late 1933, Keynes kept telling Roosevelt, in order to defeat the recession, the Great Depression, you're going to have to borrow $400 million a month. Do that, and everything, use the money sensibly, and everything else will fall into place.
Yeah. Well, I know, because I used to travel across the States to some degree, and they've got great roads, etc. And many people attributed that to the New Deal. So building roads means you have to hire people to build the roads. Yes. They get paid, they spend the money. All of a sudden, there's some activity in the economy where there might not have been quite so much before.
Sure.
And all of a sudden, everyone starts to feel better. Now, the cynics will say, this is all very well and good, Professor Mochrie, but what really changed things was the war.
Oh, I would have to agree that the war was extremely important, but let me turn this round slightly. The most rapid period of growth of the United States in peacetime was between 1934 and 1937, when Roosevelt effectively had accepted Keynes's arguments.
Yeah.
There was more rapid growth of the United States economy in 1941, 42, 43 as it moved on to a war footing. But by the way, one of the great things about the democracies was that they had absolutely no difficulty in going, we're going to have to fight a total war, and we need the population on our side. So they fought hard in order to make that possible. And perhaps the greatest achievement, Roosevelt and Keynes's greatest achievement, they never lived to see it. They both died of overwork long before it happened, but they put in place the institutions which led to the post-war settlement. Paul Samuelson, one of Keynes's greatest disciples, wrote his textbook, the first edition of his textbook, Economics, in 1948. And when he published it, the problem that he was concerned about was mass unemployment, a return to the 1930s. By the time he got to the third edition in 1953, he was concerned about the challenges of containing inflation in a society which already has full employment. We didn't have anything like the 1920s, and we have not had a major war in Western Europe since 1945. That's testament, I think, to what Roosevelt and Keynes achieved. Yeah. It's economics, or understanding that there's nothing political which is also economic.
It is interesting. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground tonight. We've got a couple of 3 minutes left. Is there anything you would like to talk about that we haven't, in fact, covered so far? Is there any specific, a couple of 3 points that you really felt before the program started, I really want to make these points? Feel free.
I think that it comes back in many ways to the message of the book which I've already published, and indeed the work which I've been doing since I published the book. But what seems most important to me about the economy is to understand that well-being is indeed the purpose of the economy. The word economy itself comes from the Greek idea for household management. And within that, what we see, household management was understood to be part of the what a good citizen should be achieving by Aristotle.
Yeah.
And so part of that was prudence, the practical skills which are required, and we see that particularly in Aristotle's economics. Then we get to Aquinas, as I've mentioned, and Aquinas emphasized justice. Then we get to Adam Smith. For Adam Smith, the great virtue was temperance. Now, this is nothing to do with going on the wagon. This is temperance as in patience, as in being willing to wait for the long term. Remember what I was saying, well-being is not something that we can achieve overnight. It's not a quick fix. It's thinking deliberately about how we achieve it. And finally, there was Keynes. And Keynes surfed on risk and uncertainty in his personal life and in his professional life. So Keynes, the philosopher of uncertainty, that required courage. And so, in fact, what I would say, the way that I would describe it, to summarize, economics is about the pursuit of virtue. That should appeal to you as your ethicist. Yeah. And so Keynes, exhibiting prudence, justice, temperance, and courage, was the complete economist. So there you are. That's my takeaway for you tonight.
I mean, it's remarkable. The pursuit of virtue. Mm-hmm. Did he perhaps have a different definition of virtue?
Not entirely, no. I mean, Keynes probably wouldn't have thought about it in virtue ethics terms himself. Keynes was very much more influenced by the Cambridge philosopher G.E. Moore, who emphasized the Aristotelian pursuit of the good, the true, and the beautiful. So that's how Keynes imagined it. But again, it's about a practice in life. It's not about solving a problem. Yeah. It's about acquiring the habits, the dispositions, which are going to lead to great happiness.
Right. Here's the question we ask all our guests in conclusion. If you could look 5 years ahead, describe Scotland.
Closer to independence, but not having achieved it.
Could you just expand a little bit, because we've got a couple of minutes left.
Oh, I've still got a couple of minutes. Sorry, I thought this was interesting for the last seconds. Right. My watch must be fast. Right. Yes. So I think that when it became obvious that the SNP was not going to do well in the last British general election, I think there were some far-sighted people within the independence movement who started thinking about what comes next, long before the election. And those people are starting to work together. Okay. So I think that the challenge what we're starting to see, you may know I'm involved with the Scottish Currency Group.
Yes.
And we are thinking, how do we actually, what do we have to do in order to be in a position that we could set up a central bank and issue a Scottish currency so that the Scottish government can spend money? But more importantly, so that the day after independence, you go into, I don't know, Tesco or Marks and Spencer, and you hand over your card, and the payment's accepted. Yeah. Because the great worry in 2008 was that if Halifax Bank of Scotland had gone bust, it would have taken down the entire payment system. No one would have been able to get access to the money in their bank accounts. Yeah. And I've had serious discussions with senior bankers whose opinion was that if that had happened, the government would have had to get troops out in the street to keep order.
Yeah.
I don't want the day after independence to be anything like that. So we have to do the hard work now,
Yeah.
You mentioned Ireland right at the start, just
Yes.
as I was listening. Michael Collins was a very, very good logistics expert. He would not have been caught out by COVID or anything like that. He was always an expert in getting resources where they were needed, when they were needed. And that's what the independence movement needs in Scotland.
Excellent. We need a whole bunch of Michael Collinses. Super. Robbie, thank you very much indeed. It's been, as we say, we strive to inform, educate, and entertain, and you've done all of that for us tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I just want to say a few concluding remarks, if you can stay on the line once we go offline. Thank you, everybody, for watching tonight. I know many of you have been engaged, people calling it a cracker of a program, and they like what they've heard. Tell everyone else. And in addition, please support the crowdfunder, because Kevin is only possible to put on programs like this, where he works his ass off, if you'll excuse this indelicacy, in order to bring it to you tonight, and plus all the other shows. So if you support him, you're actually supporting yourself. And in addition, you're supporting Scotland. A big thank you to Robbie, and a big thank you to all of you watching tonight. Good night, stay safe, take care.